And just before I start, it's a pleasure to be here. I wouldn't count myself an expert on geopolitical events. Everything's moving so fast and furious. I, like you, end up spending most of my time taking notes, trying to make sense of this all. I'm also very conscious of that good army maxim is never get in the way of a soldier and his lunch. But we'll try and cover a rich plate of issues. Where was I at 9/11? I was, as Mike said, privileged to be commanding the SAS. And I was in the Balkans, high up on the Macedonian border with Albania, trying to resolve another Balkan conundrum, which then was actually relatively straightforward when the news came through. I spun back to my headquarters in Skopje to see the replay of the second aeroplane going into the Twin Towers, and recognised then that this was no accident, but what we had been fearing, that a weapon of mass destruction might be used by a terrorist organisation. I was immediately reminded by a conference workshop I'd been holding at the camp of the garrison in January of that year with members of the security services and others. And we were talking about a weapon of mass destruction, whether it was a chemical or a radiological device being used by a terrorist entity. We went through a whole lot of scenarios, how we might react. None of us predicted that it would be an airliner packed with fuel flying into office blocks in New York. So that's where I was, and very privileged at the time, but also pretty apprehensive about what we were getting into. And here we are now, 17 years on, and I'm not sure what the forecast really is.
Yeah, and just on that, 17 years on, you wrote in your article in our Prospects magazine that, and I quote now, the threat posed by Islamist extremism is global, persistent, evolving and ideological. So I guess the question is, how do you counter this? Or is it simply a game of whack-a-mole for indefinitely?
Yeah, I'm not sure there is a role for the whack-a-mole, but the challenge we face is that even though we've been fortunate this year in the United Kingdom, we've had no attacks. As some of you might have read, Andrew Parker in his statement he's going to be making today, says that they're still thwarting one attack a month in the United Kingdom. And he quotes 45 taking place in Europe in the last 2 years. We had 5 successful attacks last year. I actually count that as a further 12 to 14. We lost 30 people, over 30 people, 36 people, and over 300 injured. If more of those attacks got through, we could have had over 1,000 people killed, 300 people killed in the United Kingdom and maybe 1,000 injured, and that would have put it in perspective. But what we're facing now is, I don't think it's an existential threat from terrorism. There's some other threats out there we can cover, but this is something which at the moment appears to be, as Daesh transforms itself from holding ground in the so-called caliphate, which is now lost, into more cultish, more disorganised terrorism, which is much, much harder to counter. And I think in the short answer to that, the role to interdict these terrorists, whether it's overseas, in Syria, Iraq and elsewhere, but also in the UK mainland, is that we need to get away from this sort of target-set, focused approach to taking on terrorism. We've got to address the problems, the underlying problems, which turn many young men and women towards radical extremism.
How crucial, this is more, I guess, for day-to-day life, how crucial has simple vigilance been in preventing terrorist acts? From the members of the public, just from a members of the public perspective, almost.
Yeah,
is terrorism now part of the fabric of modern society, and we all simply have to accept that? And there's an element of vigilance that people shoulder, or?
I think terrorism is sometimes and counter-terrorism, and the counter-terrorism strategy is sometimes not a helpful word, because in my background, counter-terrorism was absolutely what the police security forces and special forces undertook. The problem is actually much, much wider than that. It's about problems of integration, it's about community breakdown, it's family breakdown, it's disillusionment, it's people who don't have opportunities. And they're seeing within that where they live in society, whether it's here or in Europe, and it's much the same as symptoms, is that there's opportunities being offered by forms of extremism and extremist groups. And I go back to that point about cultish terrorism. They're more attracted to this ideology it's opportunity, it's excitement, it's offering them something different. It's a more exciting brand. So the vigilance part of your question, many of you will remember the sort of IRA days where both on the mainland and in Northern Ireland, people were very good about spotting suspicious activity. Vehicles which were laden down in the boot were suspicious, or suspicious packages. Well, now you're trying to detect, identify, be vigilant against people who look like you and me in many cases, or in our multicultural society, they're everyday citizens. And we're talking a very, very small proportion. So how do you identify and be vigilant on that? But the government's communications, the rather infuriating, and I'll get it wrong, of see it, sort it, say it, or whichever way it is, which is preached at you. I mean, that's what they're trying to do, to get people more alert to some things which look out of the normal.
Touching on weapons of mass destruction again, are the dangers of state-sponsored terrorism increasing? I'm thinking now, I suppose, perhaps the recent nerve agent attack on the Skripals, but also we could possibly link this to what happened in Iran.
Yes, I think there's two parts. That long state-sponsored terrorism has been around for a long time, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas being sponsored by proxy by states, Iran and other countries. I think the Skripal poisoning or attempted murder in Salisbury is very concerning. I mean, that again it seems to be, and Andrew Parker says in his speech today, but it all points back to Moscow and Putin. But on that as an aside, I mean, you know, the Skripal worked with Putin. He betrayed the KGB as it was then. And as Putin said, you know, if you take 30 pieces of silver, you're going to be taken out. And the Russians do like a good poisoning. It sends a much more powerful message rather than hiring a hitman and a pistol and shooting them in the back garden. That would not have the same effect. But the concerns, and I look at this in my day job at Paul Ree, is about the terrorist acquisition of chemical and radiological material. And you may have picked up in the press 2 weeks ago about another ricin biological threat which was foiled. These are horrific weapons, and if the terrorist Islamist extremists or others were to get hold of them, and we're talking sort of radiological material which you might find within hospitals or research areas, strap it to a piece of homemade explosive, you're talking a quantum difference in the damage, not just to people, but long-term economic damage, business interruption, going from maybe a few weeks, and we all saw what happened at Borough Market, and we saw in Salisbury the sort of business interruption, into months and potentially years. We know they have the intent, the capability. They've talked about online, about inquiring radiological material out of oil fields in Iraq. But I suppose in the adaptive nature of terrorists, my concern, I think, is more about the access of hazardous chemical material, chlorine, which you might use for your water purification, getting a big barrel of that, which you don't need any license to do, and blowing that up and then witnessing the resultant effects.
One question I ask now as a father, which is how scared should we be? And what I mean by that is whenever there is a terrorist incident in the UK or in Europe, I remind my daughters not to forget to look both ways when crossing the road, make sure their seatbelts on, all the boring stuff. And it's a bit like the fear of flying, where the most dangerous part of any flight is actually the drive to the airport. Is there a danger that the media portray terrorism as an existential threat, when actually the risk of it happening to any individual in this room is very slight?
I was asked this question the other day, which someone said, what kept me awake at night? I rather light-heartedly, I share this with you, I have a small flock of Jacob sheep at home in Herefordshire, and what keeps me awake when I weekly board down in London is that they break into the garden, which they're apt to do. But on a more serious note, no, I don't see it as an existential threat. If you look at the statistics of pedestrian deaths, people being run over by cars in 2015, 408 people were killed. Knife homicides in 2016 were 2003. I think they'll be significantly higher this year from the statistics we've seen to date. And I read an article, and I couldn't find the figure, but an American survey had said that more people had died on their lawn mowers in America than they had from terrorism. and the same number dying in the bath. So it is a minute amount. And if we look at back in the 80s and things like Lockerbie, the number of people who were killed per year, it's much, much higher. So my concern is not about, and I use these words carefully, it's not about the number of fatalities. It's more the undermining of what we stand for in terms of our democratic way of life, our freedoms, and this divide which is growing in terms of the haves and the have-nots, of those who are disaffected, and what I was saying in an earlier piece. That's to more of me an existential threat within the United Kingdom and Europe.
Okay. Is it fair to say that though the threat to an individual may be slight, for a government it's actually quite high, a democratic government? So if a government is perceived as being weak on security, and I'm thinking of the Madrid bombings now, actually for a government there's quite a high risk to an attack.
Yes, I mean, governments obviously put the security of their people at the very top. And if that is undermined, and I think we were starting to see this last year with a number of attacks which gained their own momentum, I think, from Manchester, Westminster, London, Borough Market and everything else. Our duty, a government's duty, is to protect its people, both home and away. And it comes back to this political debate about resources and the like. And on that point, I think, yes, and as a former soldier, we always wanted more resources, and I'm sure the police and others could do with more resources. But we're talking about a step change in the threat and the number of people who are trying to do us harm. And again, you may have seen the figures that there are over 23,000 people who are the police and security services are aware of who are trying to commit some form of terrorist attack against us. 23,000. 3,000 of those have been active, and 600 live cases at any one time being monitored and under investigation by the police. So that is a quantum, even if you had a policeman on every street corner. And Paris, you mentioned that. I was there last weekend for a long weekend and was struck by the number of police. It doesn't bother me, but that's the level of vigilance and security you need to have. And as we saw yesterday, someone goes out and murders more people in a crowded place.
Going to the main news of last week, which was the withdrawal by the US from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Has Trump, and it's a shame Freddie's not here, I've got a great quote about Trump. Timothy Snyder, the author, described him as an American failure who has been deployed as a weapon by Russia, which I quite liked. But do you think that Trump has now unleashed a genie that will not easily go back into its bottle?
Yes, I mean, my experience of the Middle East, I think absolutely so. I'm like many people, I think, very worried about what he's done there. I think he's conflating two issues. One of the Iranians trying to acquire a nuclear capability versus their meddling proxy wars within the Middle East. I suspect also there may be some confusion about what he's been able to achieve with Kim Jong, maybe early days on that, but he can apply the same mindset and approach to the Iranians, who are very different. I think there are some bigger issues here of, that, we're seeing that once again, the US is not honouring its word in these peace deals and other negotiations. And I would have thought Kim Jong will be looking quite closely at that, because the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, there will be a similar one for North Korea as there is for Iran. But I worry also about this sort of split in the Atlantic divide as well, which is not helpful. And we'll see Iran turning further towards Russia and China, which they're already starting to do, which again is probably not helpful. And again, Rouhani, who is a moderate leader in Iran, elections come up in 2020 and in 21. We may see a return to the fundamentalists and more extreme leadership within it, within Iran. And all of this fueling the wider tinderbox of uncertainty and crisis within the Middle East. And the Saudis, I think, have been clear that, if Iran goes back and develops a nuclear capability, they will do the same, which, we will rue that at our cost. So I think it is all extremely worrying, and it will be interesting to see whether the European Union and ourselves and other signatories to the Joint Comprehensive Plan can keep Iran within the deal. It was a bad deal, but it was the best of a bad deal. He has actually, many of the centrifuges have been turned off, a lot of enriched uranium. Mike Pompeo, the American Secretary of State, said 98% had been removed. But they still, and they'd had numerous visits by the Atomic Weapons Inspection Team, but they weren't allowed onto the military sites. There is still this big concern about intercontinental ballistic missiles. So it's very, very messy, and I think deeply concerning.
Just one more question on North Korea before I hand over to the audience. Everyone's wondering how it will go, the summit in a few weeks. I'm curious your view on, and I haven't heard this much, what does China see as the ideal outcome to that summit?
Yeah, I confess to not being a China-North Korea expert, but I think the context of this is interesting. And Trump may have pulled off the coup of a lifetime here. Let's see how it progresses. But we were very, very, very close to Trump unleashing his fire and fury on North Korea. And I think Kim Jong, many would say Kim Jong's an irrational actor, but I think Trump could be seen as more irrational than Kim Jong, and I think he realized that he was being serious and could potentially sacrifice 40,000 American servicemen and women and others within the peninsula. So I think that made him think again, Kim Jong, and I think it got the Chinese even more worried that he was going to go ahead, either through a miscalculation of something happening. But I think the Chinese are deeply worried about a unified, or were in that case of a unified Korea with American forces right up on its border. And I think this will still be a concern that the US have been seen to pull off the deal, and hence why we're seeing Xi and others putting so much emphasis of trying to get this negotiation resolved.
And if, let's hope it goes well, but if it doesn't, if negotiations fail, do you really think the US would carry out a military strike? Or was it not more likely that the world simply accepts North Korea have nukes and contain it?
I think, and I was talking to a friend of mine who is a former head of CT Operation Global Counter-Terrorist Operations in the CIA, and his view, and I was agreeing with over a drink, that it was dangerously close. And the only thing which Kim Jong hasn't yet done is being able to connect a hydrogen bomb with an intercontinental ballistic missile. He's gone from solid fuel, getting techie, to liquid fuel, which means that rockets can be deployed that much more quickly from remote sites. So that uncertainty was building, and the fact that he demonstrated he could reach mainland United States. And I think that really was driving Trump's decision. But as I said, there was 40,000 US servicemen and women, plus Seoul, who were going to be potentially struck by all these 80,000 conventional artillery pieces. And my worry was, at the time, like many people, was that, this miscalculation, what was defined as maybe a hostile act or otherwise of an American aircraft being lit up by radar, was that going to be enough to trigger a response?
I think I'm going to hand over to the audience. I've been told any questions almost within reason, so I'm sure someone out there wants to know just how close Ed and his lads got to bin Laden in Tora Bora in 2001.